At this point, the instructions for the advanced track is going to differ from the basic track construction of the 18th century pocket. So now you're going to need your other two pattern pieces, your front and your back that we've not done anything with, and then the other piece that we've done our pocket opening in. And what we want to do is we want to layer all of these fabrics together and flatline them together as one piece before we finish the raw edges with bias binding. So what you want to do is you want to take the piece that you want to be the back of your pocket, place that on your table wrong side up, lay the lining piece that corresponds to that one right side up so that the wrong sides are together. Get everything nice and lined up. Then you're going to take the side with the pocket opening that we've already sewn, and you're going to lay it with the lining sides together. So when it's all stacked up, you see it looks very much how the layout of the fabric of the final project is going to be. So I'm going to get everything lined up nice and straight, and we're going to pin all the way around. We are going to baste all four of these layers together before we do our bias binding. We could, in theory, follow the same steps that the other track is doing, where we flatline the back pieces together, the lining and the fashion fabric, but we can also put all four of these layers together at once as well. So I'm just pinning all the way around. Making sure that as I'm pinning, I'm not shifting these layers drastically to cause any kind of bubbles. We want this to stay nice and flat. Hence the term flatlining. It's not really why it's called flatlining, but in this case it is. Okay, so now that this is all pinned together, we want to take it to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch right along the outside edge here within our seam allowance. Okay, so welcome to my homework studio. This is where I am recording these videos. So that's why this machine looks a little different than what we have in class. I have changed the stitch length on my machine to the longest length it can do because I want to just baste these layers together. Actually, I need to shift my setting so that my needle is in the middle. And I'm just going to run the edge of my presser foot along the cut edge of the fabric to make all these layers function together. I'm starting at the top of the pocket, and I'm just going to go all the way around where I pinned. Depending on the machine, since there's so many layers here, you may need to pull the pins out as you go. Looks like my machine is being a little cranky about it. Be careful as you go. This is one of the reasons that we are flatlining this all together, is that I'm actually, as I'm sewing, there's a bit of a bubble that's being pushed along. So I am removing my pins as I go for sure now, so that I can make sure that this all comes out flat and I don't get a weird bubble along the edge of my fabric. And it's kind of righted itself now. Clip our threads like always. So now all of these layers are stitched together and they're ready for our bias binding. Let's take a moment to talk about bias tape. So you can do store-bought bias tape for your project, or you can make your own bias tape. So this right here is bias tape that I made for my thesis project. As you can see, I made way more than I needed. So this is actually what I'm going to be using for my project. And I have prepared this as a double fold bias setup. As you can see, whenever we open it up, it's folded once, folded twice. And that is how we want our bias tape to be for this project. So I'm going to use this because it's special and I like it. But you can also use store-bought bias tape, and it comes in single fold or double fold. The only difference really between these two is how many times it's folded. So on the double fold here, I'm going to find the start, it is just like the other section that I prepped. There's one fold. Well, come on, open up. Two folds. It's folded twice. Once in again. The single fold is made up very similarly. But the only difference is it was only folded to the inside once. So you can use single fold as well. You'll just need to prep it by pressing it in half one more time. And this folded half is the actual size that your bias will be with the technique that we are using for applying our binding. So let's get reset up for putting on the binding. To begin our binding, our bias binding, we want to measure the length of the outside edge of the pocket. And honestly, all I do is I measure it with the binding. So I'm gonna pull off a long length here, keep it attached, don't cut anything yet. Give myself a bit of a tail on the top and just roughly measure it out like this by lining it up to the edge. Okay, just like that, and I'm going to give myself a little length on the top as well. I'm going to cut straight across that bias. Now I know I have plenty here. Okay, so I want to flip this pocket over, work from the back side. Turn this so I can manipulate my fabric a little better. I'm going to take my bias and open it up all the way. This edge right here, I'm going to line up with the cut edge of my fabric. When you're doing it, you do want to leave a length sticking off from the top. We will cut that excess off later once this is all applied. I'm going to pin this on from the back side. And the nice thing about bias is that it does actually have a little bit of stretch to it. So as you're laying it down, try not to pull it, because see how much that's stretched on me? Try not to pull it too much. You want it to stay mostly flat. But then as you go around the outside curve, we are going to pull it a little bit to get it to go smooth and flat around that curve. So now is the point where I'm really starting to give the edge of my bias a little pull, just enough to get it to shape around the corner. If you notice this side is starting to bunch up, totally fine. When we flip it to the right side, it's going to lay flat. I'm rotating the pocket around to make it a little easier on myself. Since we already stitched it together, it's not going anywhere. I don't have to worry about trying to keep it flat on the table in one spot. So what we are effectively doing with the bias binding, there's two things that we're doing. One, it's a nice little decorative element that can add a pop of color to whatever you are constructing, but it also serves a functional purpose in that it's going to enclose the raw edges of the pocket so that we don't have any fraying going on. We won't have any kind of seam allowance along the inside of the pocket. So when this is all done, your pocket will actually be about 5/8 of an inch on each side larger than your paper pattern because we're not sewing our seam allowance toward the inside of this garment. So that's something to consider is if you're finishing off something with bias binding, if that is also the same stitch that's attaching all of the layers together, then your seam allowance is just the width of the bias binding. So, okay, so this is all pinned into place. Let's bring this up here. So you can kind of see, it's hard to tell on this fabric, there is a crease from where this had all been folded together. That is where I'm going to stitch. I'm going to start on one side and work my way all the way around following this crease. This technique is called stitch in the ditch. So let's go do that. All right, so now we're gonna follow the crease that's here. It is hard to see on camera, but I promise I can see it in person. And make sure my stitch length is back at the usual length. Back stitch and go all the way around. The important thing as you're stitching is if you struggle to stay on this line, it's better to go toward the cut edge of your fabric than toward the rest of the bias because of how this is going to flip around to the right side. Remember, the trick with curves is to go slow. Sorry, I just realized my hands were in your way for that whole curve section. Now right here, this is a place where I made two pieces of bias stitched together to create a long length of trim. So when you get to something like this, if you have it in your bias binding, which you might, you want to make sure that the seam is pressed open and that you don't accidentally push the seam allowance toward one side or the other because that's going to make it extra bulky at that point. Trim my thread. Okay, so let's get all of our pins out and then we're gonna press this to the other side. Welcome to my festive ironing board. So I've already taken all of my pins out and now we're gonna do a couple of pressing steps. So the first thing that I wanna do is I want to leave this kind of folded open a little bit and press it toward the outside. We're going to give it a nice little press, pushing all of the bias toward the outside edges. And I'm using my iron to help me push this in the right direction by moving my iron across that seam to push it towards the side. Now you can kind of see on the corners, it doesn't really want to push out as much. We'll fix that in a moment. There we go. Okay, so now we want to flip this to the right side. And if we were to try and pull this bias over and around this curved edge, it's gonna want to bunch up because there's too much fabric here. So what we need to do is we actually need to trim down this seam allowance. So I'm going to fold the bias out of my way. Let's see. It's a good angle to get at this from. Iron a little further away. So I'm actually going to trim down, pull my bias out of the way, and trim this down all the way around. I'm going to use my snip scissors for this. I'm trimming it down to about 1/8 of an inch or so, or roughly half of the width that I'm seeing. It's going to be especially true along the curves that we want to trim that down a bit. Now, normally I would recommend that you always cut with your fabric flat on the table. But for me, this kind of step, I just end up picking it up as I'm cutting because I'm using my hands on this side. They're actually touching the back side of my scissors to make sure that I'm not accidentally cutting something I don't want to cut. So my left hand is doing as much, if not more important work than my right hand with the cutting. Best practices is to keep your fabric on the table, but best practice for me, I have learned, is holding it up works just fine. Try both. See which feels comfortable to you. Okay, so now we've trimmed down all of that seam allowance, get all those layers out of the way. Flip this back to the front side, and now this should fold over a lot easier. Yeah, that's better. Much better. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to press the bias again over onto the front side. And we want to, especially now that we've trimmed down the seam allowance, it should be very simple to make sure that the edge of our bias, you can see the stitching right here on this part of this sewing machine. You want to pull the bias over enough to cover those stitches. So I'm going to go all the way around. It should just naturally fold in a good place since we're doing double fold bias. And I'm actually, as I come at this corner, I'm not going to go around the corner like this. I'm going to come across it this direction to help it do the curve that it needs to accommodate. This is what bias is great at, is curves. Fold. Continue folding over and around, rotating my pocket so that I can come at these curves from a comfortable angle. Just like this. And in a moment, I'm going to go back through and pin all of this in place. Okay, so now that I've pressed this, it's mostly staying where it wants to be. Some of it's flipping out. That's okay. Now we can trim off the excess here. So I want it all folded so I can get a nice clean straight cut across the top without cutting any excess off the top of my pocket. So let's get this pinned into place. And I'm gonna orient my pins this direction because it is the most effective at holding the bias where I need it to stay. Okay, my iron is really close to my wrist. That was making me uncomfortable. Let's start at this side. There we go. And if you notice, I am kind of making my pins back to each other. That's because I really, really want to make sure this bias stays exactly where I'm placing it as I sew in a moment so that it doesn't create a bubble along the edge. Last pin. Okay, so now let's take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to top stitch right next to the edge of the bias all the way around to finish off this raw edge. Okay, so now we are going to top stitch along the edge of our bias right next to the folded edge of the fabric. And to aid in this, I'm actually going to change my setting here to have the needle on the left side of my sewing machine. I need a pin tray. Okay, I have a pin tray now. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get this first pin out of the way. I'm actually gonna start a little further down because there's a lot of fabric right here on the edge. And if I start really close to the edge, my machine might struggle to pull it through. So I'm gonna get started, back stitch, and just go all the way around. Okay, so as I'm stitching, it's wanting to pull to the side here. I put my needle in, kind of reposition my bias, and hold it in place to make it go where I want it to go. This is why we pinned as much as we did. If you notice, as I'm taking the pins out, I'm actually holding the bias in place with my fingers. Just because when I take this pin out, there's a lot of space that can unfurl. Trim my threads, and then we're gonna take a closer look at this bias. So now that we've sewn along the edge here, looks nice and clean. The reason that we applied the bias starting from the back and rolling to the front is because on the back here, we weren't guaranteed to catch all of the layers here. So instead of having moments where it jumps off on the front, we have it nice and clean and we can see this line all the way around on the front. Okay, so now you're going to jump to the adding the tie video from the basic track because the instructions are exactly the same.